Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett here at Launch Academy, here again to dive into the wonderful world of HTML, CSS, and a general introduction to front-end engineering. Today we're going to be focused on how we organize and structure our HTML documents. We've talked about block level versus inline elements, but today I want to focus on thinking about how we want to lay out our HTML web pages structurally. And in order to do that, we're going to start with a general discussion of the div tag and the purpose that it can serve and the effect that it has on the W3C outline that we get as a result of incorporating that element. And secondly, we're going to look at some of the new elements that HTML5 gives us as a way to be even more specific and semantic about the structure of our HTML documents. And then lastly, we'll close out and talk just a bit about the differences between block level and inline elements, and we'll specifically look at the div versus span example because it's just so popular and endemic in HTML code. Before we dive in, I just want to remind you, if you're on Slack right now and you have questions as we're live streaming this, please leave me a question in the Slack chat. Spencer and I are keeping an eye on that Slack chat channel to make sure we get all your questions answered. And if you haven't yet signed up for Slack, we actually changed this up so that you can navigate to a Slack chat channel. And I thought I had it bookmarked, but I don't believe I do. Spencer, do you think you could maybe put that in the Facebook comments for folks? I think it's HTML, yeah, html-show-slack.launchacademy.com. You can navigate to that, enter in your email address and your first name and your last name, and get on the Slack chat channel so we can talk more about your progress and you can share some code. And it's been really wonderful interacting with other students, kind of critiquing their code and helping them out, how to think about their structure of their HTML documents, and just in general what it's like to be a software engineer and what it's like to do front-end development. So I hope you'll join us, and I apologize for those that are coming late to the program. We did have a problem with one of the Slack chat channels. We've since remedied that with this URL. So if you sign up here, you'll get right into that Slack chat channel. I hope to see you there. I hope to chat with you and talk more about what we're learning and what we're doing here at Launch Academy at large. Awesome. All right, so with that, let's dive into today's material. So if you remember where we left previously on last episode, right? We talked about some of the meta elements in our head, and we talked about the difference between block level elements like our H1 tag here and our P tag here, and inline elements like strong and EM. Today I want to take a deeper dive into thinking about how to section our website. So we've noticed, and we've seen in some of the code in the Slack chat channel, that this information, the H2, the P tag, and the unordered list are contextually related, right? There's something about this group of markup that represents a concept or an idea. And as it sits right now in the HTML outline and just in general aesthetically on the page, there's really no way to glue these ideas together. Well, thankfully, even in HTML4, we had the ability to basically wrap contextually related elements together inside what's known as a div tag. So if we go ahead and we just throw all of these in a div tag, let's watch the effect that that has on the HTML document and then also how it affects our W3C outline. So I just created an arbitrary div tag around this contextually related material, and I save that and I refresh my page. And you'll notice that that div actually provided no aesthetic change in our HTML document. And that's desirable at this point because we're just trying to represent that these ideas are related structurally in our HTML document. And usually we'll use things like an ID to uniquely identify a particular section on our site. Now, ID attributes are special in HTML, and we use IDs to kind of call out and generalize the sections of our site as we start dividing up everything that's contextually related on the page. The one rule of thumb to have as it pertains to the ID attribute is that you can only have one hobbies div on the page. So your IDs must be unique across all HTML elements. So you can only have one HTML element with the ID of hobbies. So you want to be careful to not duplicate that ID for the rest of the HTML document. And this ID, for now, kind of just gives us a clue of how we're contextually thinking about these three related elements. But later, when we get into CSS, and even with some JavaScript, we'll be able to isolate this specific element on the page because we've identified it with an ID. Likewise, we can generalize about a section of a page by providing it with a class. So we could call this about list, and basically generalize the idea that we're going to have a few of these on the page. As we see here, we've got hobbies and goals and social media listed out. So I might want to apply this about list class as a way to kind of show that this div is related to this div that we're going to create. And notice that I can duplicate my class, but I can't duplicate my ID. So I absolutely have to, if I want to specify another ID, I can't specify hobbies. Let's see what happens when we actually run this through the validator and take a look at what happens when we run it through. Validators, HTML. And if this idea of HTML validation is foreign to you or unfamiliar, or if any of this markup looks crazy to you or confusing to you, it's really important to go back to the old episodes. Particularly episode 2 will help you out quite a bit to make sure that you understand everything about accessibility, about standards, and optimizing for the W3C standard. So you want to make sure you go ahead and review that. And David writes, so if we create a div ID, could we create a drop-down navigation menu with links attached to the div tag to quickly navigate to different parts of the web page? Actually, that's a really good question, and we can cover that at the tail end of the episode if we have time. To be able to jump from section to section on an HTML web page, we can use a combination of location anchors and named anchors. And so if we don't get to that, David, you can use those as keywords to search for, and I'll share some resources in the Slack chat channel after the episode so you have some ideas around how to do that exactly, that exact skill. But for now, for the purposes of what we're doing here, the IDs are primarily oriented as a way to uniquely identify the various sections and elements of our page. And this is really, for until we get into CSS and JavaScript, a tool for you as a way to just contextualize the information that you're grouping in things like divs and section tags and nav tags. So we're going to dive into that. But first, I want to show you what happens when you have a duplicate ID in your HTML markup. See, remember that we said in last episode that red is bad. So the W3C validator here is basically telling us and trying to help us fix our errant code. By the W3C standard, and as long as we're adhering to those standards, which we should, to basically ensure our HTML looks the same across all of our web browsers in the marketplace, we want to fix this issue so that it doesn't come back to bite us in different browser experiences or when we try to isolate this particular ID using CSS or JavaScript. So we get this error, and it tells us exactly what line numbers we need to look at and we need to remedy to basically get this to validate. So we know that we've declared a div with ID hobbies on line 40 and lines 27. So we see on line 27 here, the ID of hobbies, and on line 40, the ID of hobbies. So we know what to fix. And this is the wonderful sort of tool that the W3C validator is. It gives us a hint, and it's trying to help us write our HTML code better. So you really want to embrace that validator and use it heavily so you know that you're writing proper and semantic and standards compliant markup. It's going to save you a lot of headache down the line. So we go ahead and we should change this ID to reflect the contextual group that this particular element represents. So here we see that we have an about list that's very similar in structure to our hobbies list. So they're related, they're kind of contextually similar, but they have a unique identifier per the format of the ID. And just a note on naming conventions and how you structure your naming conventions. What's important is to remain consistent. So at Launch Academy, we like a hyphenated class and ID name. So we're going to separate our words using a hyphen, and we're going to use all lowercase. And it's really up to you. You can be entirely arbitrary. Some people use underscores to separate words, and some people just combine the words. You can even capitalize words as you work through as well. The important thing is to be consistent with yourself and when you're working with a team, to have kind of documented standards in that way to make sure that everyone is in agreement as to how you're going to name your elements and how you're going to assign classes to your elements. So moving forward, we'll use the convention of all lowercase with hyphens for both our IDs and class attributes. Cool. Okay, so let's rerun this through the validator and see what happens. We get green. Green is good. We love green. Awesome. Okay, so we're ready to move on. And I've talked a little bit about the div tag, and we could go ahead and assign another div tag here. But I have some different ideas around what I want to do with our social media and our favorite quote. So we're going to hold off on modifying those for now. So the div is something that you'll see very, very consistently across the web. If you're doing the work of going out to some of your favorite websites and viewing the source and using the Chrome inspector to kind of check things out and see how front-end engineers are writing their HTML code, you should see div tags. You'll come into contact with these div tags. Thankfully, with HTML5, we now have the emergence of some better section-oriented, layout-oriented HTML markup. So we're going to talk about the section tag, the header and footer tags, and also the aside element as well. And these are all new in HTML5, and they've come to us as basically a reaction and a response to the web development community just constantly having these elements on the page. So most HTML documents that you write, you're going to end up using a section element. You're going to have a header. You're going to have a footer. A lot of pages, particularly e-commerce websites, will have sidebars, right? So these things are pretty predominant in the web, and most web developers prior to HTML5 would just use a div to generalize about these sections. So when the HTML5 standard came out, we got a more rich a set of elements that we can use to describe the semantic layout of our page. So before we change these divs to sections, I want to first just take a look at the outline that we get as a result of this document. So see here that the heading level outline is providing us with a semantic and structural perspective on how we're organizing the page. So you can start to see how the W3C standard and most search engines kind of highlight and emphasize the outline of your page by the direction given by the H1 and H2 tags. So these H1 and H2 tags are driving the heading level and structural outlines in our document. Now, if we varied up the tags, we'd see deeper levels of nesting, we'd see various sort of layers, but our page is pretty simple now. As we work through the rest of today's lesson, we'll continue to take a look at the structural outline and the heading level outline to really observe and see if there's any changes. one of the most important jobs for you as a front-end developer is to think about this heading level outline. And that's why we're spending so much time on the semantics and what it means to write good quality HTML. Not only does it make for a more consistent web experience for the folks that navigate to your web pages, but it also makes your content much more searchable and much more digestible by search engines. So not only are you making the experience more pleasurable and consistent for the folks that get to your page, you're also creating the ability for more folks to get to your page because you're creating markup that's more likely to represent what you're documenting in search engines. So those two things combined are really, really important to think about as you're learning this HTML structure. Cool. Okay, so we talked about divs, and you can use divs in HTML5. There's no basically like accessibility error or standards-based error that says that you can't use divs. In fact, many developers still continue to use divs. But for the purposes of embracing the latest version of the W3C standard, and just to provide a good amount of richness to our HTML code, we're going to go ahead and consistently use the section tag. Now, check this out. I want to show this as well. If I go and I copy this and run this through the validator again, what do you think will happen? So just take a moment and think about that to yourself around the markup change that I just made and what potentially could go wrong now that I've made that modification. All right, let's run it through the validator and find out. If you guessed that I changed my opening tag, but I didn't change my closing tag, you guessed correctly. And here's the validator here again, telling us and trying to help us fix the error that we introduced into our code. So just another example of how you can be editing your HTML code and how you can very easily make a human error. The W3C validation is going to really help you out. I'm going to just increase the size of this validation here so you can start to see some of the error messages that you get. So we know what we need to fix. We know where we need to fix it thanks to the validation error message on line 58. And we go ahead and fix that. And then we can have now a section with ID hobbies and a section with ID goals. So we have two related elements that indicate our layout, our structure, our contextual structure of the documents. We've found a way to generalize and categorize those particular sections on the site. And we've found a way to uniquely identify them using IDs. So pretty cool. Now, the section is a neat little tool, but we also have at our availability new and additional HTML5 elements. Things like the nav, the header, and the footer elements. So let's incorporate those into our web page and again take a look at how that affects the aesthetics of our web page and then how it affects the structural outline of our web page. So I'm going to go ahead and create a header element. And as we get deeper into this sort of more complex world of HTML, you start to get a feel for the elements and what can be nested inside elements. So headers, sections, layout type divs and things like that, those elements can support what's known as flow elements or elements that typically contain content. So pretty much anything that you can put inside the body tag, you can put inside a section, nav, header, or footer element. And MDN has a very well documented and thorough explanation of what flow elements are. And for us to go through that in the video wouldn't make a ton of sense, wouldn't be valuable of your time. So we're going to move on. So here I'm saying that the real kind of meat of this page is it's about me, right? We're creating a page that describes who we are as people and what our goals are for the course. So it just makes sense to place that H1 in the header. And if there was more information that we wanted to supply, like my phone number or my email address or anything like that, we could go ahead and put that in the header as well. And in this case, I'm going to decide to take this p tag and add it to the header because it kind of just belongs there. It's contextually describing and qualifying who I am. So I'm gonna actually move both of these p tags up. And I might just let this image stand out. And basically, all of these opinions are subject to exactly that. It's a matter of what you think makes sense structurally in your document. And as you get more experience and you work with more front-end engineers, you'll start to get a feel for what works and what doesn't, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So that will take a little bit of time. And the more code that you produce, and the more you look at, and the more critique and feedback that you get from folks that have been in the industry, the better off you're going to be. So keep writing code, keep viewing source. That's going to make you a much more informed front-end engineer that's going to be able to use and harness more of the HTML5 that's available to us. Cool. Okay, so we're going to keep this section the way it is, and this section the way it is. But I'm going to move some of these social media links to another special element called the Nav element. And most sites will have either primary navigation either at the top of the page underneath a logo, most typically, or next to a logo, or at the side of a page. And we'll use the Nav element to basically give the browser in search engines a hint that our, primary navigation is going to end up here. So we can go ahead and take our social media links here, and we're going to make them part of the nav. So essentially what we're doing here is we are basically telling the browser in the search engine that these are important links. These links matter and are important to kind of consider as primary navigation for this particular web page. So we put our primary navs typically in an unordered list, and we can stylize this later using CSS. But we typically put our primary navigation in this nav element. And the closer you can get to the head, the more semantic value you're going to get out of that nav element. So something to keep in mind. And you don't have to have explicitly links, right? So we may want to indicate to the end user that the current page that we're on is about me, right? So I'm not going to put that in an anchor tag because that's the page we're currently on. One aside I also want to mention is we've been working quite a bit in this document and making quite a bit of changes. And one thing that we always stress here at Launch Academy, whether you're writing HTML or you're programming using Ruby or JavaScript, you really want to decrease the time of feedback. You want to make sure that you're speeding up that feedback loop so that you're constantly seeing how the code changes you're making are affecting the end product, the end result that you're going for. So I've gone almost a little bit too long in the editor in saving my work before going back to refresh and rerun my validation. So as a web developer, a common paradigm, common kind of pattern that you want to follow is be in your editor, make a 1 or 2 line change, save it, and then go back to your browser and refresh. Go back to your editor, make a small change, go back to your browser, refresh, right? If you keep the space between the different pieces of feedback that you get, you're less likely to introduce human error in lots of spidey, like spirally type problems and issues in your code. So you want to make sure that you're constantly saving and going to your browser, refreshing the page. I know it's a little monotonous, I know it's a little bit slow, but that's the best way to see the code changes affecting change on your HTML document. Now, because we're writing good, clean code here, we haven't really seen much of a change in the context of the visual aesthetic display of our document. We see the introduction of our nav higher up on the page, and we see the header element that's up here as well. And this is sort of magic. We see that in the markup, but we don't necessarily see it in the HTML. And again, later we'll be able to isolate this header and treat it differently using CSS. and make it look differently and show that that information is contextually visually. Let's rerun our validation and see how our outline has changed, if at all. So we got our green is good validation, and we go down and we see that the nav element has since been introduced as a piece of the structural outline. So you can see how the proper use of a semantic piece of HTML has added structural priority to important pieces of our web page, in this case, the nav. If I go ahead and add a header here and say like H3 important links, let's see how that affects the content outline. And you're only going to see this outline if you go ahead and you check that outline in the show field here. So you want to make sure you check that. Otherwise, you won't actually get this piece of data underneath the actual markup that you've written. So notice here that our H3 has the same weight as some of the H2s in our section elements. So you can kind of play around using nesting and the important elements like the nav tag to kind of trick the structural outline into thinking something is more important than maybe its H2 sort of siblings or predecessors. So you want to keep an eye out on how your various markup changes affect this structural outline and this heading level outline. And what's really great is if you have a closeness to the content and an understanding of the structure of the HTML that you're trying to convey, you can kind of always keep this in mind as a way to check to make sure that your outline reflects the ideas that you're trying to convey on the HTML document. So really, really cool thing that the W3C provides, super handy, particularly if you're into search engine optimization and really having a nicely organized page. Cool. All right, so we talked about the nav and the header. And really, to close out our discussion of HTML5 block level elements, I'm going to cover the footer as well. So we could decide to put all of this into a footer, but it doesn't really make sense as a footer. Typically, your footer is going to have things like contact information, maybe a map, or something that is contextual to the actual HTML that you're representing. So this is still kind of describing things about me. So it makes sense for this to appear in the main body of the HTML document. So we're just going to go ahead and create some new sections here for our favorites. And I'm going to say quotes. And every section does not require both an ID and a class. You can have one or the other or neither. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, I think it just makes sense to kind of contextualize and generalize some of the sections that we're building as we work through this HTML page. So I might call this favorite things. And I might call my favorite math class equals favorite things. So I have sections that are on the same level of nesting, but they have different classes. So I can use these classes to kind of relate this section and this section and make them in contrast to the previously created sections that have the class about list. And this will come in super handy when we start writing CSS, so we can isolate only the about list sections and only the favorite thing sections. So the idea of ID and classes become very, very, very useful when we start to work with CSS and JavaScript. So these pieces didn't make sense as part of a footer, but what we could do is we could put our copyright in the footer. So I'm going to use the HTML entity for copyright, and at the time of this recording, we're recording this in 2016, and I could say Dan Pickett. and I could put this in an EM tag. So your footer kind of has like the legalese, maybe a privacy policy, maybe a way to get in touch, those kinds of things. So contextually, we relegate that type of markup and that type of content to the footer. And that's what we're doing here. So we refresh the page, again, trying to keep that feedback loop nice and tight. And we go down to the page and we can see that I've added this copyright Dan Pickett, right? And this is now in the footer element. And let's see if that has an impact on the structural nature of the document. And this is kind of the process of front-end web development, and at least dealing with HTML and CSS, is we make small changes, we check that it looks good in the browser, and we check that it runs well through the validator, and that's how we proceed. And we just incrementally build our HTML in such a way. So we see that the introduction of the footer really didn't change much. And we can actually go ahead and put this in a P tag. And a pro tip for you, those of you using Atom, if you do Control-Shift, nope, that's in TextMate, never mind. But I want to put these in a P tag and basically represent that this is a paragraph of text. The other thing I want to talk about as a function of your editor is notice how the coloring of the editor is helping us. So watch what happens when I don't properly close my footer element. It's the editor, like our W3C validator, is trying to do us a favor and give us a hint that something's wacky, right? So the fact that this P tag is miscolored and not pink, and it totally depends on what theme you're using, what color it actually is. But the variance in color between this HTML element and this HTML element gives us a visual clue, a visual hint that we've got an error in our HTML. So if you see some wacky coloring in your HTML editing, that's the editor itself trying to give you a hint, trying to help you out that it's not seeing the HTML that you think is happening in your head. So we introduce that. So use the tools, use the validator, use the editor as a way to write better HTML. All right, so pretty quick, pretty on time today. Again, if you have any questions, throw them in Slack. It looks like I'll have time to cover that anchor concept, and we can talk about that. But lastly, I just want to say, notice that my page is extremely ugly, right? And that's okay. Right now, we're focused on creating the nice structure and semantic structure of our HTML document. And later, right around episode 5 or episode 6, we're going to learn how to stylize these elements and start to make them look pretty. But the first thing we want to do, and at Launch Academy we always say you want to put the first things first, right? What matters most is having sound structure and a sound outline for your HTML markup. Only then will you be able to apply the CSS that's going to make it look pretty. So we're starting with the structure, then we'll dive into the aesthetics. For now, we're quite focused on making sure that our outline looks solid, our markup looks solid, and we're getting familiar and comfortable with our editor. So just put that aside. All right, so let's talk about jump to links. So if I wanted to, I may put in my nav something like, we've got our goals at the bottom of the page and favorite quotes. So what I could do is I could say, we could make these links and say a href. And we'll make these links that point to specific locations on our HTML document. So here we're going to put our a tag in here. And we are going to say favorites, right? So in the past, in the previous episode, we used that fully qualified URL where we had an HTTPS or an HTTP followed by the // a host name, and a path, right? In the case of jumping to specific locations on a current document, we're actually going to use a special kind of href known as a location reference. So we're going to say here, we want to point to a location on the page called favorites. And we can do the same for the about section of the page. Now, if we refresh the page and I click on that link, it's not going to take me anywhere because I haven't yet specified those destinations as part of my HTML markup. But notice that it does change my URL in the URL bar. And this is known as the location hash. And this can point to specific sections and scroll you to specific sections in our HTML document. So here, if I create an anchor with name about and an anchor with name favorites, it's going to provide me with the ability to jump from place to place in our HTML document. So I'm going to start about at the header, actually. I'll start the about at the about list sections, just for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to name, we don't want that by the about list. We want that in the favorites, right? So we're going to name another anchor. And we're going to call this favorites. And this anchor name is basically providing us with that jump to availability. And notice here too, by definition of the W3C standard, the anchor tag must have a closing tag. So I couldn't just put an A tag here because it wouldn't be sure where that closes. So the named anchor is a little bit special and different from the anchors that we've been using thus far. So these are what I like to call named anchors that give us specific locations to jump to using the location hash in our more typical anchor tags. So href is going to point to specific locations in our HTML document, and names are going to actually identify those locations. So we made those changes. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. And if I go to About Me, it's going to scroll right to the beginning of the About Me section. And if I hit the favorites, it's going to jump me all the way down to the page. Now, if I had more content below my favorites, the favorites would come up further up on the browser window. But because I don't have much content afterwards, there's not enough vertical real estate to cause that scrolling behavior, that jump to behavior. So this is as far as it's going to go. So the jump to links are pretty interesting, kind of cool to hang out and play with. You see that kind of behavior a lot on frequently asked question pages and things like that. And it's a really handy and cool tool to know. So that's that. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit more about this relationship between what elements can be nested under other elements. And we talked about the div tag. Which is great, and we saw how that sections off block level content. Notice that each of these elements exist on their own line, right? So goals doesn't show up next to hobbies. They show up vertically separate, right? So what happens when I want to contextualize inline material? Well, thankfully we have the span tag. So if I wanted to isolate the word links, I could do so with a span. And just like a section or a div, I can specify a specific ID to that particular piece of HTML content. So we can use the span to basically contextualize inline information. One thing that's important to know is, by definition of the standard, in general, I can't place block level elements inside inline level elements. So if I actually go ahead and put a div in here, I'm probably going to get a warning or an error in my validation. So let's see. So I've got a span inside an H3, which is perfectly valid, but I think the fact that I have a div inside my span, it should trigger a W3C validation error. If anything, it's poor practice. Good. So here, the W3C validator is telling us that the element div is not allowed as child of element span. So as you get more experience with these HTML elements and you see more of these errors, you'll get a feel for what elements can exist in other elements. So if you're working with your validator and you get this type of error message, don't freak out. It's just trying to inform you that the way in which you've structured your markup is not in line with the W3C standard. So again, we get the line number on where this occurs on line 27. So we know exactly where we need to fix that issue. So we can get rid of that div. And we can, in fact, use another span here if we wanted to have a nested span. So in general, you can't nest block level elements inside inline level elements. Something important to know. So that about wraps us up. What I'd like for you to do is take the page that you're building and create your own sections, give them IDs and classes, create a header, create a footer, create this nav idea, and also try to make use of the aside tag. We didn't cover it, but essentially if I had sort of meta content that is tangential to the material that's on the page, I might say something like, hey, check us out at Launch Academy. Because this is really not contextual to information about me, I might reflect that in an aside tag. So if you have kind of a cool note or something that you'd like to reflect as sort of a small aside, maybe you're an entrepreneur yourself or you're working for a company that you're really proud of, maybe give them a shout out through the aside element. And we can use aside also as sidebar type navigation as well. So we might have an aside with a nav inside it actually. So you can see the universe of combinations of HTML elements that you can incorporate into your HTML web pages. So I'd love to see some creative ideas. I'd love to see you start laying out this page that describes who you are and represents who you are. And as always, join us in the Slack channel. Hit us up. If you go to htmlshowslack.launchacademy.com, if you haven't got your invitation, go there, get active, and show your work, so that I can provide you with some feedback and we can just all get to know each other better. In the meantime, keep coding, keep viewing source, and I will see you on Tuesday, and we're gonna cover the HTML table and what that represents. I hope to see you then, and I hope to see you in Slack. Until next time.